In 1932, a man named Earl Whitmore walked into a sprawling camp of canvas tents on the outskirts of Sacramento, California, with nothing but a battered tin cup, a pocket knife, and a rolled-up burlap sack over his shoulder. He had $12 to his name. 14 months later, Earl walked out of that camp with a small savings, a network of loyal friends, a rebuilt truck engine, and more practical knowledge about living outside the system than most people accumulate in a lifetime. His daughter, now 91 years old, still uses 7 of the tricks she learned watching her father in that camp. She says they saved her family twice more after that, during hard winters and harder times. The story of Earl Whitmore is not unique. Across the United States, between 1929 and 1941, an estimated 3 million Americans lived in tent cities, squatter camps, and makeshift settlements that newspapers of the time called Hoovervilles, after the president many blamed for their suffering. These were not places of despair alone. They were places of extraordinary human ingenuity, where people discovered, invented, traded, and perfected survival methods that local authorities found threatening, that federal agencies tried to suppress, and that urban planners actively worked to forget. Today, we are going to uncover 25 of those tricks, several of which were explicitly outlawed, others that the government quietly pressured communities to abandon, and a few that got entire camps bulldozed rather than allow them to spread. If you find this kind of history valuable, make sure you are subscribed right now, because this channel exists precisely to preserve what the powerful tried to erase. Number 25 is going to surprise you, and by the time we reach number 1, you will understand why the authorities were genuinely afraid of what these tent city residents had figured out. Number 25. The newspaper insulation system. It sounds laughably simple, but this technique was so effective that several municipal housing authorities in the 1930s quietly began discouraging its spread because they feared it would reduce demand for their new public housing projects. Residents of tent cities discovered that crumpled newspaper packed tightly between layers of canvas or burlap created an insulation barrier that could raise interior sleeping temperatures by as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit on cold nights. The trick was not simply stuffing newspaper randomly. Experienced camp residents had developed a precise method where sheets were loosely crumpled rather than folded flat, creating air pockets that trapped warmth, and then layered with the printed side facing inward to reduce moisture wicking. Entire families survived brutal Midwestern winters in unheated tents using this method, and the technique spread from camp to camp through word of mouth with the kind of precision usually reserved for professional trades. Government inspectors who visited these camps frequently noted the newspaper insulation in their reports, almost always with recommendations that residents be relocated to proper housing. But the real concern, as one 1934 internal memo from a California relief agency reveals, was that families using these techniques were managing to refuse public housing without appearing to suffer. They looked comfortable. They looked organized. They looked like they did not need rescuing. And that, to the relief apparatus of the New Deal era, was profoundly inconvenient. Number 24. The communal ash cache. Every camp of more than 30 families developed what residents called an ash house or a gray store, a central collection point for wood ash from cooking fires. This ash was then distributed and used in ways that modern preppers rediscover approximately every 5 years and act like they invented. Wood ash was used as a cleaning abrasive for pots and skin, as a basic lye precursor for soap making, as a soil amendment for small camp gardens, as a pest deterrent scattered around tent perimeters, and critically, as a water purification pre-treatment when combined with charcoal. The gray store was communally managed, with rotating stewardship, and represented one of the earliest informal resource-sharing institutions in these camps. Local authorities hated it for a reason that seems almost comical today, but was deeply serious at the time. The ash cache represented collective resource management outside the market system. It was, in the eyes of some officials, dangerously close to communism. At least 3 camps in Ohio were pressured to disband their communal ash systems, after reports from local businesses complained that camp residents were not purchasing lye soap or cleaning products from nearby stores. Number 23. Salvage tin can stoves. The humble tin can was the engine of survival cooking in Depression-era tent cities. Residents developed a sophisticated hierarchy of can-based cooking technology, from the simple rocket stove made by nesting cans of different sizes with air channels cut at the base, to elaborate multi-chamber cooking systems that could simmer a stew on top while simultaneously heating a flat griddle surface for cornbread. The key innovation was the controlled air feed design, where precisely sized holes cut at specific angles created a natural draft that produced an almost complete combustion, meaning the fire burned hotter with far less fuel than an open flame. An experienced tent city cook could prepare a full meal for 6 people using wood scraps that could fit in a shoebox, compared to the armload of wood a traditional campfire required for the same task. City fire marshals frequently cited these stoves as a fire hazard and used that pretext to confiscate them or force camp residents to tear them down. But the real issue in many jurisdictions was that scrap metal dealers were complaining that camp residents were collecting and using discarded cans that the dealers considered their territory for bulk resale. Number 22. The Relay Credit Network. This was perhaps the most sophisticated economic innovation in the tent city world, and the one that most consistently alarmed authorities. In camps large enough to sustain it, residents developed informal credit systems based on labor promises rather than currency. A man who could repair shoes would issue handwritten labor vouchers, essentially, "I owe you 1 hour of shoe repair," and these vouchers circulated through the camp as a form of currency. A woman who could cut hair would accept 3 shoe repair vouchers as payment for a haircut. The skill-sharing economy that emerged was remarkably stable because it was backed by actual human capacity rather than by scarce cash. These networks were sometimes called skill banks or promise circles in camp slang. They were almost universally condemned by local merchants who correctly identified them as a parallel economy that allowed camp residents to meet their needs without spending money in nearby stores. In some cases, county officials explicitly prohibited them as unlicensed banking activity, and at least 2 documented instances survive of camp leaders being briefly jailed for operating what authorities characterized as an illegal currency scheme. Number 21. Rainwater gravity filtration. Access to clean water was among the most serious survival challenges in tent city life, and residents developed filtration systems of impressive technical sophistication using only salvaged materials. The standard design involved a series of metal drums or buckets arranged in descending height, with the contents of each layer providing progressive filtration. The first bucket contained coarse gravel to catch large debris. The second contained fine sand. The third contained charcoal made from burned hardwood, crushed to a fine powder. The fourth, in better designed systems, contained a layer of clean moss or grass that acted as a biological pre-filter. Water poured into the top emerged from the bottom clear, with significantly reduced pathogen load, not completely sterile by modern standards but sufficiently clean that camps using these systems consistently showed lower rates of waterborne illness than camps without them. Public health authorities acknowledged the systems worked. Their problem with them was that clean water from a filtration system the residents built themselves undermined the argument that these camps were inherently unsanitary and needed to be cleared. The systems made the camps look sustainable, and sustainability was the last thing the clearance advocates wanted the camps to look like. Number 20. The rope calendar and weather journal. Experienced tent city residents who had been in camp for multiple seasons developed the habit of maintaining what they called rope calendars, a length of knotted rope or cord hung inside the tent where daily knots marked the passage of days, with different knot styles indicating weather patterns: a half hitch for rain, a square knot for frost, a simple overhand for clear days. Over months, these ropes accumulated a tactile weather record that experienced readers could use to predict seasonal patterns. A man who had spent 2 winters in a Sacramento Valley camp could look at his rope calendar and say with reasonable confidence that the rains would return within the next 2 weeks based on the pattern he had recorded the previous year. This knowledge was invaluable for planting the small gardens that many camps maintained, for timing foraging expeditions, and for preparing camp structures against incoming weather. It sounds rudimentary, and it was. But the discipline it represented, systematic observation recorded in physical form, was the same discipline that professional meteorology was built on. Number 19. Buried cold storage. Before refrigeration, and with no access to ice in most camps, Residents developed a precise science of underground food storage. The key insight, already known to frontier settlers but refined and systematized in the camps, was that soil temperature at roughly 3 feet of depth remains relatively constant year-round in most of the continental United States, hovering between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even when surface temperatures swing from freezing to blazing. Camps developed communal cold pits dug to exactly that depth, lined with boards, covered with weighted canvas lids, and managed by designated keepers who tracked what was stored and by whom. Root vegetables could last months, cured meats weeks. Even dairy products kept significantly longer in a properly managed pit than in open air. If you are still watching and you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because the next several items are where the history gets genuinely controversial, and you do not want to miss a single one. Number 18. Foraging route maps. Every established tent city developed a network of foraging routes mapped in the minds of its most experienced residents, and sometimes drawn crudely on scraps of paper or scratched into flat pieces of wood. These maps identified abandoned orchards within walking distance, railroad right-of-ways where edible plants grew undisturbed, city dump perimeters where discarded but usable food could be salvaged, and the seasonal locations of wild plants, berries, and mushrooms. The maps were treated as serious community assets, passed between residents with the gravity of property deeds, and updated continuously as conditions changed. Local authorities in several cities took active measures to block foraging, not because of any safety concern, but because landowners near campsites complained that residents were taking fruit from abandoned orchards and gleaning fields that had already been harvested. In at least one case in the San Joaquin Valley, a tent city was forcibly relocated specifically to move residents away from a network of productive foraging routes that had made the camp more or less food independent for months at a time. If you have your own knowledge of old foraging routes or forgotten food traditions, leave it in the comments below, because that knowledge deserves to survive. Number 17. The candle lamp shade system. Lighting was a luxury, and wax candles were precious in the camps. Residents developed an elaborate system for extending the effective light of a single candle, using reflectors made from salvaged tin cans cut and bent into parabolic shapes. A single candle fitted with a properly shaped tin reflector could produce sufficient directed light for reading or detailed work in a radius of several feet, effectively tripling the practical utility of a single flame. More importantly, residents learned to make candles themselves from rendered animal fat collected from butcher scraps, using twisted cotton cord as wicks. The fat candles burned dimly, and with more smoke than pure wax, but were essentially free. Experienced candle makers learned that adding a small amount of saltpeter, obtained by leaching old soil from stables or outhouses, to the rendering fat produced a significantly cleaner, brighter, and longer-lasting candle. The saltpeter candle technique was genuinely little known outside of chemistry circles at the time, and represented the kind of applied folk chemistry the camps were constantly producing. Number 16. The tick and louse powder. Personal hygiene and parasite control in the camps relied heavily on two substances: diatomaceous earth, scraped from creek beds and dried, and finely ground dried herbs, particularly pennyroyal, tansy, and cedar shavings. These were combined into what camp residents called flea powder or bug dust, and applied to bedding, clothing, and tent floors. Diatomaceous earth works by physically abrading the waxy outer layer of insects, causing them to desiccate and die, and it does so with complete effectiveness and zero chemical toxicity. Modern pest control companies sell the exact same product today at significant markup. The herbal additions provided additional repellent properties and a scent that residents found more tolerable than the alternatives. Camps that maintained regular powder application protocols consistently reported lower rates of typhus and other louse-transmitted diseases than comparable camps that did not. Public health authorities who documented this fact in their own reports still routinely recommended camp closures rather than powder distribution, a decision that cost lives and that several historians have argued was driven as much by a desire to dismantle the camps as by genuine health concern. Number 15. The smoke signal dinner bell. Large camps with hundreds of residents faced a coordination problem for communal meals and community meetings. Runners were inefficient. Shouting carried poorly across large areas. Residents in multiple documented camps settled on a system of smoke signals, not the complex code of popular imagination, but a simple three-signal system. One heavy smoke column from the communal fire meant the meal was 30 minutes away. Two quick puffs in succession meant the meal was ready, and a sustained thin smoke meant a community meeting was called. The system worked reliably across distances of half a mile in calm conditions. It required no materials beyond the existing cooking fire. It was entirely free. Municipal authorities in cities with nearby tent camps repeatedly cited these smoke signals as nuisances and fire hazards, and in at least 3 documented cases used the existence of communal signal fires as justification for entering camps without invitation to conduct inspections, which were frequently used as opportunities for intimidation and property confiscation. Number 14. Medicinal mold cultivation. This one requires a significant historical caveat. The residents who practiced this did not know why it worked, only that it did. Multiple accounts from tent city residents and social workers document a practice that, in retrospect, was a primitive form of antibiotic application. Residents noticed that bread mold, the bluish-green fuzz now known as penicillium, when applied to infected wounds or skin lesions, frequently accelerated healing and reduced infection. This was empirical folk medicine, observed and shared without any understanding of the underlying biochemistry. Alexander Fleming had published his discovery of penicillin in 1929, but the antibiotic use of the mold would not be clinically applied until the 1940s. The tent city residents, working from observation alone, arrived at a similar practical conclusion years before doctors had access to penicillin medicine. Some accounts describe deliberate cultivation of bread mold on damp cloth specifically for medical use, which is extraordinary. This practice was, predictably, condemned by medical authorities who visited the camps, not because it was ineffective but because it was unsanctioned. Number 13. The communal seed bank. Every camp that survived more than one planting season developed a seed bank. Residents who obtained seeds from any source, purchased, traded, salvaged, foraged, saved from produce, or received as charity, were expected to contribute a portion to the communal seed store before keeping the remainder for private planting. The communal seeds were stored in dry, sealed containers and cataloged by type, variety, and estimated germination date by whoever in camp had the best literacy and organizational skills. The seed bank served 2 purposes. It ensured the community had planting stock even if any individual's private supply failed, and it preserved heirloom varieties of vegetables and fruits that commercial agriculture was already beginning to phase out in favor of higher yield but lower flavor alternatives. Several of the vegetable varieties preserved in Depression-era camp seed banks have since disappeared entirely from commercial cultivation. The seed bank system was, in a very real sense, an act of agricultural conservation performed by people who had nothing, preserving genetic diversity that million-dollar seed vault projects attempt to replicate today. Make sure you are subscribed if you want to keep hearing stories like this one, because this history deserves an audience. Number 12. The Rendering and Soap Cooperative. Soap was expensive and essential, and camps that survived multiple seasons almost all developed some form of collective soap production. The process required lye, which was made from wood ash dissolved in water, and animal fat, which was collected from butcher scraps, slaughterhouse discards, and rendered animal bones. The two were cooked together in large pots in a precise ratio that experienced soap makers learned to judge by the feel and smell of the mixture rather than by measurement. The resulting soft soap, called camp soap or gray soap in various accounts, was less elegant than commercial products, but chemically identical in its cleaning function. More importantly, it was free. Camps that ran soap cooperatives supplied their entire community with cleaning products at no cash cost. Soap and detergent companies, who were marketing hard to Depression-era consumers and lobbying for favorable regulations, were documented in at least 2 cases to have contacted local officials requesting that communal soap production in nearby camps be discouraged on health grounds. The health grounds cited were never substantiated. Number 11. The night soil garden. This is one that people today find uncomfortable, but it was an agricultural technique of genuine brilliance that the camps practiced with considerable sophistication. Human waste, properly composted before application, is among the most effective soil amendments ever used in agriculture. It is what powered Chinese and Japanese agriculture for thousands of years before synthetic fertilizers existed. Tent city residents, living in areas with poor or depleted soil, developed controlled composting systems for human waste using designated latrine pits that were managed in rotation. When one pit filled, it was covered with a thick layer of soil and allowed to rest for a minimum of 60 days before the decomposed material was applied to garden plots. The gardens fed by this system consistently outproduced gardens using other available amendments. This practice was banned in virtually every municipality where tent cities existed, officially on sanitation grounds, and those concerns were not entirely without merit in cases where the system was poorly managed. However, the bans were applied as broadly to well-managed systems as poorly managed ones, which suggests the sanitation rationale was at least partly pretextual. Number 10. The barter fair circuit. In regions with multiple tent cities within traveling distance of each other, residents organized periodic barter fairs, informal markets held at neutral locations where people from different camps could trade goods, labor, information, and skills without any cash changing hands. These fairs served an economic function that was critically important to the survival of the barter networks. They allowed goods to move from camps where they were abundant to camps where they were scarce. A camp near a river might have smoked fish in surplus. A camp near an orchard might have dried fruit. A camp in an industrial area might have salvaged metal tools. The circuit of exchange that the fairs enabled created genuine economic efficiency that neither the camps nor the surrounding economy could have produced through individual effort. Federal relief officials documented these fairs with a mixture of admiration and alarm, and at least 2 academic economists of the era wrote privately, in letters rather than published papers, that the barter economies of the Hoovervilles were demonstrating in real time that market mechanisms could operate without money. That conclusion was too politically incendiary to publish during the New Deal period. Number 9. The Messenger Kid Network. Information was life in the camps. Knowing that a specific factory was hiring in a town 40 miles away, or that a particular road was closed, or that officials were planning a sweep of a nearby camp, could mean the difference between finding work or missing it, between being caught unprepared or evacuating in time. Camps developed formal messenger networks using children aged roughly 10 to 14 who could travel quickly, attracted less suspicion than adults, and were exempt from many of the vagrancy laws that could land adult men in jail for traveling without demonstrable employment. These children, known in camp slang as runners or wires, carried oral messages and sometimes written notes between camps and between camp residents and their contacts in nearby towns. They were paid in food, given priority access to communal meals, and treated with considerable respect for the essential service they provided. Several state legislatures passed laws in the early 1930s specifically targeting child messengers in the camps under the guise of enforcing school attendance laws, which were selectively enforced in ways that disrupted camp communication networks, while the same laws were not enforced for children working in agriculture or domestic service. Number 8. The ear-to-the-ground intelligence system. This one is more poetic than most, but no less real. Experienced tent city residents learned to supplement the messenger network with direct physical observation. Men who had worked in railroad gangs knew that placing an ear to the ground or to a railroad rail could detect the vibration of approaching trains or heavy vehicles at distances that sight alone could not achieve. This technique, borrowed from indigenous tracking methods that had filtered through rural American culture, was adapted in the camps as an early warning system for approaching vehicles, which frequently meant approaching authorities. Sentries posted at camp perimeters who knew this technique could give 30 seconds to a minute of additional warning before vehicles arrived, which was enough time for specific individuals to slip away, for certain items to be hidden, and for the camp to present its most compliant face to whoever was arriving. It was a small but not trivial advantage, and in several documented cases, it appears to have prevented arrests. Number 7. The invisible grain cache. Food security in the camps was constantly threatened not just by scarcity but by theft, both by other residents in desperate moments and by outside actors including, in documented cases, police and local officials who sometimes confiscated food stores during camp inspections. In response, Experienced camp residents developed the practice of maintaining a hidden primary cache separate from any visible food supply. The techniques used were sophisticated for their context. Grain stored in sealed tins buried under tent floors, beneath fire pits after coals cooled, inside hollow tent poles, or in false-bottomed storage boxes. The visible food supply was always modest, showing only a few days of provisions at most, while the hidden cache might represent weeks of security. This practice was directly analogous to techniques documented in concentration camps, gulag memoirs, and other extreme survival contexts, suggesting it is a near-universal human response to the specific combination of food insecurity and predatory authority. How many of these techniques have you actually heard of before today? Leave a comment below with a number, because we want to know which ones are genuinely new to people. Number 6. The Camp Doctor's Herb Cabinet. Nearly every large camp had at least one person, sometimes a woman with midwifery experience, sometimes a man who had worked as a farmhand in a region with strong herbal medicine traditions, who maintained a working knowledge of medicinal plants available in the local environment. This person served as the camp's de facto medical practitioner, and their herb cabinet, sometimes literally a box of dried plants, and sometimes just a thorough memory of the surrounding landscape, was one of the camp's most valuable assets. The treatments used were not magic. They reflected centuries of empirical folk medicine that predated the pharmaceutical industry. Willow bark tea for fever and pain, whose active ingredient is essentially aspirin. Yarrow poultice for wounds, which has documented antimicrobial properties. Elderberry preparation for respiratory illness, which modern research has confirmed, has genuine antiviral effects. Plantain leaf for skin inflammation, which modern herbalists still use with documented justification. Public health officials who visited the camps routinely dismissed these treatments without investigation, which was not simply arrogance. It was also, in some cases, deliberate policy. Accepting that camp medicine worked meant accepting that camps could be self-sufficient, which was the conclusion the clearance advocates feared most. Number 5. The rain catchment roof architecture. This innovation was structural rather than procedural, and represents some of the most sophisticated applied engineering that emerged from the tent city experience. Residents who stayed in the same camp through multiple rainy seasons developed tent configurations that incorporated dedicated water catchment surfaces. The key design used a secondary canvas or oilcloth panel rigged at an angle above and behind the main tent, connected to a channel that directed captured rainwater into a clean storage container. A properly designed catchment panel of roughly 6 square feet could collect more than a gallon of water per inch of rainfall, and in regions with regular precipitation, this could entirely eliminate the need to haul water from external sources. The panels were rigged using salvaged rope, wooden stakes, and whatever waterproof material could be obtained, and the designs that circulated through the most experienced camp builders showed a clear evolution toward increasingly efficient and stable configurations over the period. Engineers who encountered these structures in the 1970s and 1980s, while working on humanitarian architecture projects for refugee camps, found themselves arriving at functionally identical designs through formal calculation. Number 4. The Document Protection Protocol. By the mid-1930s, experienced camp residents had developed elaborate protocols for protecting the documents that represented their claims to citizenship, employment history, and identity. Birth certificates, discharge papers from the World War, marriage licenses, skill certifications, and any papers demonstrating prior employment were treated as the most valuable possessions a person could own. They were kept in waterproof containers made from oilcloth or salvaged wax paper, stored in multiple copies where possible, with copies distributed among trusted individuals in the camp to prevent total loss in a single theft or confiscation. Men who had nothing else of apparent value were frequently found to have these document caches, sometimes sewn into the lining of clothing or hidden in double-walled containers. The sophistication of these protocols reflects the harsh lesson that many camp residents had already learned. Without documents, you did not legally exist, and without legal existence, you could not access relief, could not be hired, and could not challenge any abuse of authority directed at you. The vulnerability of the undocumented person was as real in 1934 as it is today. Number 3. The security through apparent poverty strategy. This is perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated survival technique in this entire list, and it required a kind of collective discipline that is genuinely remarkable. Experienced camp residents learned to maintain a deliberate appearance of greater poverty and helplessness than was actually the case when dealing with outside authorities. Tools were hidden. Food caches were concealed. Skills were downplayed. The organized, functional nature of the camp's internal economy was masked behind a presentation of desperate neediness, precisely because demonstrating real resilience and self-sufficiency consistently triggered hostile responses from relief agencies and local officials who needed the camps to be helpless in order to justify their own existence and authority. This performance of victimhood was recognized by the residents who practiced it for exactly what it was: strategic theater. Camp leaders coached new arrivals explicitly on how to interact with outsiders, what to show and what to hide, how to speak and how to avoid speaking. It was a survival skill as real as fire starting or water purification, and it worked. Camps that mastered this presentation survived longer and were raided less frequently than camps that openly displayed their organizational sophistication. Number 2. The Intercamp Warning and Mutual Aid Treaty. In regions with multiple established camps, camp leaders developed formal, if unwritten, mutual aid agreements. These agreements committed camps to warning each other in advance of planned government actions, to accepting refugees from camps that were cleared or raided, to sharing food in cases of acute shortage, and to coordinating on labor market information. The treaties were negotiated between camp leaders through personal meetings and maintained through ongoing messenger traffic. They created a genuine regional support network that dramatically improved survival outcomes for residents of participating camps compared to residents of isolated camps. Federal relief officials were aware of these networks and consistently characterized them as dangerous, radical, or subversive in their internal communications. The historian Elizabeth Cohen, writing decades later, would describe these mutual aid networks as one of the most remarkable examples of working-class self-organization in American history, noting that they emerged entirely spontaneously from necessity rather than from any ideological program. The government's hostility to them was, by any rational analysis, hostility to people helping each other survive. And that brings us to number 1. Number 1. The permanent knowledge transfer system. This was the survival trick that the government feared most, the one that made everything else on this list more dangerous in the eyes of the authorities, the one that explains why camps were bulldozed rather than simply emptied, why experienced camp leaders were specifically targeted for arrest and removal before general clearances, why relief workers were sometimes instructed to discourage residents from teaching skills to newcomers, and why the oral history of these camps was systematically neglected by academic institutions for decades. The permanent knowledge transfer system was simply this: experienced residents of Depression-era tent cities made it their explicit purpose to teach everything they knew to everyone who arrived. Not casually, not incidentally, but deliberately and systematically. In the larger camps, this teaching was organized into what residents called skills circles, or learning fires. Evening gatherings around communal fires where an experienced forager would demonstrate plant identification. A skilled builder would teach roofline engineering. A soap maker would walk through the rendering process step by step. A rope calendar keeper would explain how to read weather patterns from a season's knotted record. The knowledge was not hoarded, it was multiplied. Every new person who arrived at the camp and stayed long enough to learn was another node in the network of practical human capability that the camp collectively represented. Every person who left the camp and went on to another took that knowledge with them and passed it along. The authorities understood, even if they never explicitly articulated it in these terms, that a population in possession of this knowledge was a population that could not be made permanently desperate. You can clear a tent city. You can burn the tents and fill the ditches and plow the garden plots back into bare earth. But you cannot unlearn how to purify water. You cannot confiscate the knowledge of which plants are edible. You cannot arrest a person's memory of how to build a stove from a tin can, how to read the weather from a knotted rope, how to turn wood ash and fat into soap, how to store seeds so they survive a winter, how to build a community credit network from labor promises instead of cash. The permanent knowledge transfer system was not a trick or a technique. It was a philosophy. It was the decision, made collectively and repeatedly under conditions of genuine hardship, that knowledge belongs to everyone, that survival skills are a community asset rather than a personal advantage, and that the most powerful thing any human being can do for another is to teach them what they know. The Depression-era tent city residents who practiced this philosophy did not know they were doing something historically significant. They were just trying to help their neighbors survive the winter. But what they built, in those fields of canvas and salvaged tin, was something that terrified the powerful and outlasted the hard times. And it is worth remembering right now that the tradition they practiced is the same tradition you participate in every time you share what you know with someone who needs it. That is the real survival trick, and it has never gone out of style. If this video reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with the number of techniques you already knew. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because every week we bring you more of the history that was almost lost, the knowledge that was almost buried, the stories of ordinary people who figured out extraordinary things when everything else was taken from them. The tent cities are gone. The knowledge is not. Make sure it stays that way.